So a warm welcome everyone tonight to this book launch extraordinaire. We are delighted to welcome you all. It's great to have so many of you join us tonight. So I just wanted to say a warm welcome and a great thank you as well to the people who have helped organise tonight's event, including Ambition Institute and John Catt. And Stuart Lock, of course, and all the other speakers tonight who have contributed to the book. My name is Hélène Galdin-O'Shea, and I've been working as part of researchED since 2014, since the beginning. And it's been quite exciting to see all the developments over the years, first with the conferences and the magazine published by John Catt as well, and now this increasing series of researchED books. Tonight is quite an exciting one because the topic of leadership is such an emotive one, isn't it? It's something that is tricky to talk about, and Stuart Locke, I think, has done a really good job at trying to take a very specific stance. Before we go into further details, I just wanted to say thank you very much to John Catt, one of the UK's leading publishing house, educational publishing houses, for supporting us tonight and supporting us with the books. Thank you very much to Ambition Institute, a national education charity who are helping teachers and school leaders to get better, which is what we all strive to do. Finally, I just wanted to say a quick word about researchED, which is a grassroots teacher-led project. I think project is the best way to describe it. And our aim is quite simply to try and bridge the gap between research evidence and practice, be it classroom practice or school improvement, and perhaps even hopefully systemic improvement. So that said, in a minute, we'll listen to Stuart Locke, who will talk about his stance on the book. But just very quickly to kind of outline some of perhaps my feelings about all this, if it's not too pretentious to outline my feelings, and God knows I feel quite strongly about the topic. I must admit that I was quite nervous initially when the whole idea of the leadership book was launched, because leadership, as I said, is such an emotive topic. A topic that has been discussed for many decades, and particularly with the advent of New Labour and all the school reforms that followed. And generally, it's talked about in a very specific way. There is a prevalence in the discourse around leadership of something focusing on things like exceptionalism and heroism. So it's not unheard of to focus on things like leadership styles, something based on trait theory, or looking at leaders' behaviours and trying to replicate those. And very often we focus on one single person who is set out as this kind of great leader in the search for normative criteria. And so when you combine this with a culture of performativity, which I think is undeniable in our schools, it's quite easy to see the kind of the tricky problems that might follow. The themes that are usually covered by leadership literature tend to focus on charisma, inspiration, vision, transformation. So all those kind of cult values, if you like, that are meant to be enacted in our schools. And I'm probably not the only person to have a bit of an issue with that. So particularly like people like Grint in 2010, who might have tried to expose the sacred nature of leadership, or other people who have to some extent offered a critique of the existing literature around leadership. Chris Moles particularly, who was quite stringent when it came to criticising the evidence, which is quite patchy, around leadership. I think he said that it lacked intellectual rigour, if I remember right. So all in all, Stuart has done a really great job at trying to find a way in that is a little bit different from this kind of generic approach to school leadership. when you work in a school that has great leadership, it's quite easy to see, it's quite amazing to see, but it's very difficult to replicate, because very often the best you can do is to observe surface behaviors, surface features. But because a school is the sum of its parts, and so much more than the sum of its parts, I think the book is really good at trying to establish some kind of architecture of what effective leadership means. And so each chapter focuses on a different part of the great whole. We also know that obviously contextual factors are absolutely important when it comes to schools. So the only thing that we can offer in this book is a series of best bets. And that's definitely the approach that Stuart took to the book. So just to introduce Stuart, who's going to talk to you now. Stuart is obviously CEO of Advantage Schools, which is a small growing school trust in Bedford. Stuart Locke has been head teacher of two very successful secondary schools, and I'm very, very grateful to him for managing to put together this book, which I think was quite tricky. And he was so gracious in taking on all the comments that came his way along the way. Stuart, if you're ready, I think my time is up. So without further ado, and unless there are any questions or anything else that I can tell you before Stuart starts, I'll pass it on to Stuart. Thank you very much, and enjoy the evening.
Thanks so much, Helen. I hope I can be heard all right. And I think you introduced the book really, really well. As Helen said, I'm Stuart Locke, CEO of Advantage Schools, and I had the privilege of editing this book, and hence the great privilege of having read and reread the chapters from some real experts in school leadership. So welcome from me to everyone. Thanks for joining us towards the end of the most endless of half terms. Why is this book required? My view, given how much it costs, I don't think we do education well enough in the UK. That doesn't mean that we don't work hard enough. It doesn't mean we don't have committed people. I don't mean it as a slight against anybody, but it does mean that I think we can do better with outcomes, with the proportion of pupils who leave school being able to read well, engage in academia. And I think we can have an education system that means that everyone, regardless of their background, can be learned. Indeed, I think that's an entitlement. That's how I try to run my trust, and it's how I've run the schools that I've led. I've read a lot of books on leadership. I'd say about half of them are lessons that can be learned from sport, and almost all of the rest are about business. And there's something in the content of those books that's like superhuman. I think that's partly because they're inflicted with some survivor bias. You know, if the most successful people are lucky, and I'm not saying they are, but if they are, despite their luck, there's a kind of post hoc rationalization of their success. But also I'm an avid reader, but books on leadership, even books on school leadership, had limited use for me as I became a leader. There might be a model or procedure I've used in one or two, but few stuck. What did stick is what I learnt and experienced over time in the role. And much of this contradicted what I was being told and what I read. I recall when I was a young maths teacher, I'd sit in a generic professional development session and think, this won't work in my subject. And I know many teachers have thought the same. And as I went through various levels of leadership training, I kept thinking, this won't work in my school. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Maybe I'm cynical. Or maybe the research we hear about isn't good enough or appropriate enough to guide school leaders. Why is it that I valued my experience over much of what I was learning and reading? And why is it that learning and reading didn't direct my action anything like as much as it had when my job was primarily teaching? I feel like research in education has been misused and misunderstood, and researchED back in, I think, 2013 was a part of opening up that world to me. The insights that researchers and teachers have had have been criminally unknown or hidden for years, or research of dubious quality has dominated. And if that's the case for teaching, it is even more so the case for leadership. The amount of reliable and valid research on leadership is, to my experience, not significant. And as one who wants to consume that research, even research that appears good seems to me to often be really badly used. The research that's promoted appears often to be taken from other domains and badly imposed onto education. I call this a generic approach, and I'm not denying, for the record, that it may have some merit. You know, indeed, when other leaders tell me that some aspects have benefited them, who am I to contradict that? And certainly leaders should take inspiration from wherever they like. But I think that this generic approach has been done to death. For example, it's more than 30 years since Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. Is there something we're missing? I think there might well be. This book is one that inevitably, like most things in education, requires some nuance. And I think we've been both nuanced and robust. I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. We've been nuanced because research into school leadership has been so poor. And we've been robust because rather than try and capture everything that's been said about leadership, we've tried to coalesce, as Helen just talked about, around a position. So because of this volume of research and the volume of dubious quality of research, this book had to take a perspective. And the perspective we took is that to some extent, school leadership is a unique activity. A school leader might be a bit better than the average person at running a retail business, a hospital, or a sports team. You know, if you transplant a school leader into one of those places, they might be a bit better than average, but not much more, because so much is not transferable. The mainstream narrative, what I refer to often as the orthodoxy of school leadership, is both generic in contrast to what I've just said, and a hero model. As I say in the introduction to the book, it promotes leaders who are passionate, driven, inspirational, optimistic, moral, creative, resilient, bear with me, I've got loads more, determined, astute, positive, courageous, communicative, and it goes on and then says, and they need to be great strategic leaders. They might as well write that leaders need to be superhuman. The performance of school leadership is something that is amazing when you see it. Helen talked about this. But it's so extremely hard to copy because its composites, the knowledge and experience that make up that performance, are impossible to see in the observation of that leadership. That research into school leadership is, as I've said, to some extent very immature, means it's hard to know for sure the right approach. And Helen foreshadowed this a bit for me. Also, because pupils, staff, buildings and other contextual factors are so varied, it's hard to know for sure we have the right approach. There's huge variation. So throughout the book, we've considered, as Helen described it, the best bets, informed as much as possible by research. Somebody asked me to talk about the challenges of editing a book on school leadership. And one of the biggest challenges as a result of that is working out which research to use. But the other one is about those variables when we talk about leadership: context, population, staff, curriculum, phase, and the minutiae that all of those aspects have. And as I say, I'm not sure we can ever be sure, absolutely sure in school leadership that we know we're taking the right or optimal decision. I don't think we can know for sure that there wasn't a better decision, a better approach, or better implementation. And to that end, I'm unsure that research can ever do more than inform the bet that we make. But if bad research means we make a bad bet, how does that research ever get found out? It takes years, if at all, because of the multitude of factors and the complexity. I think there's a lot of bad research and bad positions taken on school leadership. I think there are a lot of truthy statements, and what I mean by that is statements that at first glance appear to be true, even if they're not true, about good leaders doing things like setting the vision or leading with passion. And these seem to make us feel good, but I'm not sure they help us a lot in developing school leaders. I see leading schools, as I said, as a unique activity, and that we probably need to know a lot to address the challenges that are thrown up regularly. Addressing these challenges, and Jen Barker and Tom Rees call them persistent problems, as you will hear, is more effective if we know more about them. And so the book is structured around examples of how school leaders might address some of these challenges and exploring the knowledge they might bring to those challenges. It's an example of an approach that I think might challenge us as leaders to unpick the substance of running a school rather than copy the proxy of the way we see school leaders running their schools. And that's the perspective the book takes. So this evening, much like the book, we've got a number of voices to hear. I couldn't fit everybody from the book in, sadly, but there are still 7 other people for you to hear from. It was really hard to edit the contributions into a book, and I've never been to a book launch before, in person or virtually, but I now have the challenge of editing the edited book into a 75-minute virtual book launch. So what to expect, as you might imagine, we're going to move really quickly at speed and cover a lot of ground. I'm told if you miss anything, you'll be able to watch this event back on YouTube in a day or two. And of course, you can buy the book itself to dig in a bit more to what we discuss. As for you, please say hello and use the chat function. Tell us where you are, what role you do in your school or otherwise. We're also interested in what the biggest challenges of school leadership are, and some discussion around that in the chat function might be interesting. And also, if you are on social media, and particularly on Twitter, feel free to use the hashtag. It's RED, I think researchED like ED to be capitalized, but RED book launch, as if it's all one word, and we'll see you on there. We're going to move straight into the interviews with some of the contributors. We're going to move straight into Jen Barker and Tom Rees. Jen and Tom work for Ambition Institute. Jen is the Dean of Learning Design, a former school leader and teacher. Tom is the Executive Director of School Leadership and a former head teacher and School Trust Director of Education and author of a book on leadership. I'm just proving I bought it. About a year ago, they were really influential in changing my view of leadership to one that understands better what I'm doing and how I develop. So I'm going to start with them. Have we got them? We have.
Yes, yeah.
Good evening. So what is leadership in one sentence? Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Well, that's a trick question, isn't it? And one that I should refute. As we say in the book, leadership is an abstract term and means very different things to different people. It lacks a clear definition. So some use it to describe the process of influence or change, particular roles or positions of power within a hierarchy. The concept of distributed leadership is a popular interpretation, along with the phrase that everyone is a leader. And leadership can also be used often to refer to the individual traits or characteristics of an individual. It's also a relatively new term, only something we've started using in schools, for example, in the last 20 or so years. And when we're forced to summarize it in a few words, as I've dodged here, we often end up saying something pithy, like leadership is just relationships, or it's about vision, or it's about people, or phrases like management is doing the thing right, but leadership is doing the right thing. And all these phrases are sort of hard to argue with. They sound like they should be true, but at such an undefined and generic level, the term leadership itself is not necessarily a helpful concept when we're thinking about how we create opportunities for professional learning and development. So, as you say, Stuart, in the introduction to the book, for a discussion about leadership to be useful to practicing leaders, it must be located in the field, subject, or domain which is being led.
Thanks. So in one sentence, I think you're saying leadership can't be described in one sentence. It's a bit more complicated than that. You're right, and I've mentioned briefly about the hero paradigm of school leadership. What do you mean, Jen?
Yeah, so the hero paradigm in relation to school leadership, at least, was coined by a term coined by Peter Gron back in 2003, and it refers to the type of leadership which is rooted in transformation. It emphasizes the capabilities of one person, the hero leader, to transform and improve an organization. And it says that really there's only a small number of people who have what it takes to do this. And we see evidence of this type of leader in various places. So, Stuart, as you mentioned, one of the places that we see it is in job adverts, which ask for applicants to be almost superhuman. We also see evidence of it in the outgoing MPQ frameworks. So where to pass MPQH, individuals have to demonstrate that they can be an inspiring leader in a range of different situations. And the hero paradigm is something that's been criticised on many levels. So, for example, having a hero leader can work to undermine the level of buy-in and commitment of other members of staff in school. And the idea that a single individual can know and be able to do absolutely everything required to run a school effectively creates a real risk that competent leaders are put off from progressing into more senior positions because of the pressure that they face in doing so. And this is a real challenge, we think, because the idea of a hero type leader, along with some of the words that we use to describe transformational leaders, can typically be associated with masculinity. And if we're really serious about doing more to diversify the makeup of leaders in schools, we need to think really carefully about how we're talking about them. And the final thing to say is that we need to be careful that we don't supplant one trait-based leader with another. So in replacing the bold visionary leader, for example, we could move to talking about the authentic, humble leader, but we're still talking about focusing on the person rather than the work that they do, which is what we think is the most important thing to consider.
So many people watching though will have seen that, and they'll get some of that, the kind of impossibility of hero leadership and some of the drawbacks. But they'll also have seen great leaders. They'll have seen, you know, some people might say Alex Ferguson, or in history Rosa Parks, Barack Obama, or even, dare I say it, their own head teacher. Invariably, they'll be describing them as inspirational, or indeed as heroes. So why are we criticizing copying them? Tom?
So there's nothing wrong with us finding inspiration from all kinds of different places in life. All of us will find motivation from people around us, our family, friends, public figures, our head teachers, and in the books we read and the films we watch. But why is it just leaders that we can be inspired or learn from? I think we can take inspiration from people all around us. And inspiration itself is a poor method of learning anything meaningful. So even motivational or inspirational speakers, for example, are often ineffective at increasing motivation in the medium or long term. And the main point here is about transfer. So research suggests that copying surface level traits of individuals can put us at risk of missing the substance of what it is that makes them successful. So a good example, to take Barack Obama, where we might observe a leader who is a great communicator, but his ability to speak powerfully and fluently rests on an enormous amount of knowledge and a well-developed mental model of things such as economics, law, and the intricacies of the American political system. So it's not just a case of be a bit more Obama, or be a bit more Alex Ferguson, or be a bit more Jacinda Ardern and you'll run a better school. The strategies that we often notice about figures like this tend to be based on anecdote or untested theories and are unlikely to transfer into our work in schools. So what we're advocating for is harder, it takes more time, it's much less glamorous. It involves us thinking really hard about the specific things that leaders need to know and be able to do, or what we call their mental models.
So that's a bit about what is leadership, and you've moved a little bit, you've started to move into what you write about in chapter 2, because for those watching, and Jen and Tom wrote 2 chapters of the book about how we develop school leadership. Let's start with that as a question for there. How do we develop school leadership? Jen?
Yeah, so I think it's important to state that obviously leaders are they're expert in many areas of their work, but they are also novices in some parts as well. So we liken the development of expertise in leadership to any other learning process, and we think carefully about applying what we know about how people learn to the development of leaders as well. And in our model of leader expertise, we argue that expertise develops as a result of organising and applying knowledge to the persistent problems that leaders face. And in doing so, to develop mental models. And mental models can be thought of as the way that knowledge is organised to guide action. And the better developed a mental model, the more easily the leader will be able to navigate their work. They'll have more bandwidth to think about areas of real complexity, and they'll be able to manage themselves in the most effective way in the process. So in practice, that means identifying the persistent problems that leaders face, understanding the knowledge that leaders need to do the work that they do, and then creating scaffolded opportunities to practice, to receive feedback, to apply and consolidate their knowledge across a range of circumstances and increasing in complexity. And this could be a middle leader thinking carefully about the knowledge that they want pupils to learn as part of their subject, or it could be a multi-academy trust chief executive officer understanding how the principles of risk management can be applied to the running of their whole trust.
So it occurs to me as you're talking that it might be difficult for head teachers to consider themselves as novices, and that requires us to get over something. But I think as you're talking, you're particularly talking about knowledge, and I think some people looking on will go, well, this is just another false dichotomy, isn't it? Like, okay, I get what you're saying about domain specific knowledge, but don't we just need more of like some of that to add to the generic skill that we already, or the generic approach we already have to leadership? Aren't you just setting up a false dichotomy and we just need a bit of both of it? Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So Look, clearly there are things that leaders of different subjects, schools, or across different sectors do which are similar that we can consider to be generic. Developing a strategy, managing change, chairing a meeting are common examples of these. And one view is that these are two separate things, and what we need is both. That there are things like vision, strategy, and change on one hand, and then domain-specific knowledge on another, like curriculum, teacher development, or subject knowledge. But we hold a different view, which is that these two things can't be separate, and that what often appears as a generic leadership skill can't be developed in isolation. It relies on a great deal of domain-specific knowledge. So, for example, creating a strategy for reading across a primary school requires different specialist knowledge to creating a growth strategy for a multi-academy trust or a strategy for increasing attendance in a secondary school. So what appears to be a generic skill, in fact, relies on a much more specific knowledge. Now, this might sound pedantic, but it's important for us when we're thinking about professional development, because it relates to how we codify the things that we want people to learn through their development. And we think that the specialist or domain-specific knowledge, although it's essential, can often be overlooked in leadership development, which too often focuses on the generic and therefore can be disconnected from the specific field or task.
Getting hurried up, so we've got about a minute left before we need to move on. Is there anything we can learn from other domains, Tom?
Of course we can. I don't know anyone who thinks there's nothing that we can learn from other sectors or industries. School leaders, teachers are really open-minded people. But for the problems we've argued about transfer and efficiency, we advise caution. School leaders have really limited time and attention, so we have to make the best bets about how we use that time most effectively.
Great, and I think we've got time for this. The new MPQs launched last week. Have they, is there any prospect of them helping the perspective in any way, Jen?
I think they are a huge improvement. They're a great step forward in attempting to codify the knowledge that leaders need, and that will be put obviously right at the heart of leaders' professional development. I think in creating this shared body of knowledge, we bring out into the open what has previously been perhaps hidden or misunderstood, and making this knowledge more accessible. It dispels the idea that it's somehow mysterious or unobtainable. And as we discussed actually in a blog that we put out this week, it's a really exciting and empowering realization, because it means that given the right conditions, progress towards expertise is a real possibility for everyone.
And of course, Ambition Institute and you two especially will be involved in the delivery of the National Professional Qualifications. The chapters you contribute are packed with references and research and are a real goldmine to set up the whole thing of the book. So thank you both for this evening for your contribution. Moving on to Matthew. Have you got Matthew? I'm really delighted to have Matthew Evans, head teacher who's been in senior leadership for 15 years, a prolific blogger, writer, author of the book Leaders with Substance, An Antidote to Genericism in Schools. If there's a book that aligns with this one, it's this book, and I recommend it. So speaking of which, straight in, Matthew, you've written a book, as I've just said, on school leadership. It takes a similar perspective to this collection that we're launching today. What would you add from your book or otherwise to what Jen and Tom have said?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I mean, I'm really grateful actually to this leadership book, because it actually made me write mine more quickly, because I found out that this was happening, and I think it helped me move to publication. Needn't have worried too much, but yeah. So I think I broadly agree with everything that Jen and Tom say there, and I think I came at this from a similar perspective, as you say. My background, going right back to degree level, was I studied management and organisational behaviour at university. And I've always been a bit of a geek for that kind of stuff. But the more I've read about it and the more I've worked in school leadership, I'm a bit like you, Stuart. I became a little bit skeptical about the whole range of literature that was out there and whether or not it actually helped me run a school. So my book takes quite a skeptical position, I think, to begin with. And what I try to do is to build up from there to say, what can we actually say with confidence about leadership? Because I'm not entirely sure I still know what leadership is. And I think it means so many different things to different people that, yeah, and after all of that time, I'm still not sure I entirely know, which makes me slightly cynical about what it is. So that's my kind of angle and area of interest.
So, thank you. Your chapter in the book wraps it all up at the end and talks specifically about complexity. I mean, you mentioned this a bit, but can leaders ensure like comprehensive knowledge in order to address every problem, the persistent problems that Jen and Tom have talked about that they might encounter?
No, I don't think they can. So, and I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding when you talk about expertise in leadership, because the common understanding of expertise is that we talk about expert accountants or lawyers, and these are people who develop a very comprehensive knowledge in a particular domain. And they're the kind of know-it-alls, you know, they're the go-to people that you go to get your questions answered. And I think the problem with that idea is when you look at school leadership, you will never know anywhere near what you need to know to be that knowledgeable. You're just not going to get there. So there is this misconception that when you talk about expert leaders, you're talking about people who know everything and just somehow kind of more knowledgeable and more superior. When you start introducing complexity into it, I think it's really interesting, because complexity means that you can't be sure of very much at all. And I think schools are very complex places, and they're full of uncertainty. They're full of big areas of ignorance. We don't know enough about what good teaching looks like, how schools improve. So when you get this level of ignorance and uncertainty, it means that expertise looks slightly different. So no longer are you saying, who's the person who knows the answers to everything? You're then saying, who can make a fairly wise decision given how little they are in control and how little we actually know about schools. So I look at the expertise thing as not being about knowing everything. It very much about recognizing that you don't know everything, and yet somehow as a leader in a school you have to make decisions and you've got to hedge your bet somewhere. So how do you do that, and how do you deal with that as well mentally? How do you deal with that?
It occurs to me that when Ofsted, for example, really praise school leaders, actually the reality is probably that they're quite good most of the time, rather than the kind of excessive stuff that we hear. One thing that struck me as I read your chapter is I was kind of like, I stopped as you wrote, I appear to be talking about feelings. Like, what place do they have on a book in kind of the hard-nosed research and school leadership?
So running a school is really hard. At least I think it is. I've been doing that as a head teacher for about 7 years, and as you say, 15 or more years in various senior leadership team positions. I find it really hard, and I think what I've come to realize is that it's okay to find it hard. If you don't find it hard, you're probably not doing it right. And I think a lot of that is about complexity. So I really like the stuff, for example, Neil Gilbride at Gloucester University writes about dealing with complexity emotionally. And I'm not a particularly emotional person, but I think you do have to recognize that running a school is hard. You're not in control a lot of the time, particularly at the moment with everything that's going on. You have to make decisions without all of the information that you need. And that can be quite anxiety building. So I think complexity is a sort of a threshold concept to me in a way. I think the more I got into looking at complexity and how that relates to schools, the more comfortable I felt with the limitations to my abilities as a leader. And as Jen was saying earlier, you know, it's not about being the perfect leader. It's about doing the best job you can. And I think if we want more people to run schools, we need to acknowledge that you don't have to be perfect. It is really difficult, and it can be quite tough emotionally as well to do the job.
Great reference to Neil Gilbride, who, like, his stuff is great. Thank you so much. Your insights on complexity are really well placed. I used an early version of your chapter with one of the senior teams in my trust at the start of lockdown. And while we've deliberately with this book not tried to claim that the pandemic reinforces our approach, or, you know, the coronavirus means that everything we already thought is true, I remember them saying, wow, this seems apt at the time. Thank you so much, Matthew. Moving on to Danielle. Hi.
Hi, Stuart.
Danielle Dennis is director of the University of Rhode Island School of Education. She also taught my own kids and is really insightful and balanced. The challenges that we confront in the book, as I think you've heard, are to exemplify the approach that we're saying might add to leadership, i.e. to understand the problems, know more about them, and make a bet on how to solve them. Danielle contributed a chapter on the teaching of writing to the book, particularly of early writing. So Danielle, I've already said that writing a book about school leadership was difficult because of the lack of concrete evidence. You had a doubly difficult job in writing a chapter about the leadership of the teaching of writing. Where did you start?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I started with the literature we do have, which, as you noted, is minimal compared to what we know about reading. I was specifically looking for scholarship that was related to the way that children's writing ability develops. And I chose that route because I think a lot of what we have about writing tends to be kind of this idea du jour, rather than some kind of empirical research on what we know about sound practices. The bet I made in this decision was that primary school leaders have likely not been taught extensively on children's writing development, and that makes it challenging to be a curricular leader for the teachers in your building. So to develop the approaches of teaching writing that connect to both the teaching of reading and subjects, I thought it was important to really break down the requisite skills of writing.
So what are the key things leaders can do to be significantly better at ensuring the developing of writing in their schools, to ensure their schools are significantly better at developing writing?
I've thought a lot about this question, and I came up with the very academic answer that writing is messy. As you mentioned, this was a difficult chapter to write. And even with substantial expertise in literacy, although now I feel like I just call myself a know-it-all, I was not able to simply compose this chapter in one sitting. It required copious notes, outlines, text marking, writing, editing, revising. And as you know, since I requested a deadline extension, even with my knowledge on this subject, putting this chapter together thoughtfully took time. Yet I find in many primary schools, we often expect children to move too quickly from learning new concepts to writing summative pieces on the topics. And that tends to serve as evaluations of their understanding. Typically, those evaluations place quantity and presentation above substance. And I think that connects a little bit back to what Helene said in regards to performativity. I think it happens because we haven't broken down those skills that are so essential for children's writing development, and something that we have to think about and could be a big shift for school leaders. Two quick points. I'd really like school leaders to understand that writing development lags behind reading development as much as 3 to 4 years, and even more so for expository writers. So we can't necessarily just map what children have read and expect them then to be able to write at the same complexity. We have to be thinking about how that develops. And much like we do with reading, we also have to break down those essential skills necessary for children to develop as writers, so that they are able to eventually write in more complex manners.
So you've just mentioned reading, and I feel like before I do that, I should point out that a request for an extension wasn't a problem, because the delay in the book is entirely my responsibility, not anybody else's. But I know some people were expecting it nearly a year ago. But you just mentioned writing, and I deliberately got a chapter from you on writing. Sorry, you just mentioned reading. I deliberately got a chapter from you on writing and a chapter from the Reading Ape on reading. Now, she can't be with us this evening, but how does the leadership of teaching of reading relate to writing? And I know you've just said it comes 3 or 4 years later, but how are they related?
So there are 2 major connections that I see from the chapter by the Reading Ape. In the chapter, it's noted that decoding and encoding must both be taught. And I want to highlight that point about encoding. I think too often we expect children to be able to write what they read, and that doesn't happen naturally. They need to be taught how to make letters represent the sounds that they hear. The second connection is that children develop confidence when asked to write about what they know. This is particularly important when we start thinking about subject areas and the explicit teaching of content to support children's comprehension of the word and the world. There's a next step to supporting children's ability to write about what they know, and that is breaking down again to the sentence level and building their stamina and understanding of genre from there. So all of that to say that reading and writing must be planned and assessed together rather than thought of as 2 separate components of a child's education.
Great, thank you so much, Danielle. I really appreciate your input, and again, the expertise that's present in your chapter is just unbelievable. So thank you again. Do we have Summer?
Hello.
Hi. Prior to it being the zeitgeist as a result of the Ofsted framework, one could count on two hands the number of people in the UK that I knew of that were taking curriculum leadership seriously. And those who are working in schools and have written clearly and concisely on the subject are even rarer. Having written a book on curriculum design and currently vice principal at Jane Austen College in Norwich, Summer Turner is one of those people, and she wrote a superb chapter for us. So I'm going to start with curricular leadership is hard. Why is that? And what should people do about it?
Yeah, so I suppose that curriculum is an intellectual activity and it doesn't have a perfect solution. So it requires not just that you have domain knowledge about curriculum design, but also like how that plays out at different levels. So from the curriculum plan itself to the interaction between teachers and students in the classroom. And it's also requiring knowledge, of course, across multiple subjects. So it's not just about one particular domain, it's actually how that looks in all those different subjects. So I think one of the trickiest things is also accepting what you don't know and being prepared to actually learn from people who you line manage. And I think that can be really, really hard for leaders to do. It's much easier to kind of paper over subjects and feel like you gain that control and confidence for kind of coming out with those generic solutions than it is to actually step back and actually learn. And the thing you can do about it is accept where you don't know something and try and find that answer. So yeah, that's why it's tricky, and that's the kind of starting point, I think, is realizing you don't know it and that you need to learn more.
So it's really interesting on line management. It's obviously desirable for people to be line managed by people with similar expertise, but that's not always how it works in reality. In fact, more often than not, it's not how it works in reality. So if a school leader is a historian, for example, how can they line manage a head of English effectively?
Yeah, so I mean, as I just said, and a number of panelists have mentioned as well, it's about kind of accepting where you're ignorant and being prepared to take help on that. So you can learn about kind of general curriculum design principles and theories so that you've at least got some questions that you can ask those subject leaders. So how do you handle knowledge in this particular subject? I think this is, if I'm a historian, I think this is how it plays out in history. Is it similar in English? How is knowledge structured in this curriculum? Why this at this particular point? So you can start with those kind of questions, but of course you quickly come into trouble if you don't yourself know the answers. So if you don't know enough yourself to be able to check whether the answers to those questions are actually decent, so you've actually got to take some ownership, I think, of knowing more about the subjects, whether that's speaking to subject specialists, whether it's going to subject associations, reading articles, getting involved in those associations. That's where you've got to start, because otherwise you've got to manage that balance of holding people to account but actually letting those subject leaders lead as well.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's a really hard job, but I don't think there's a shortcut. So one of the things you write about is about curriculum not being done or finished, but people looking on will go like, if we get curriculum designers to produce a written curriculum and then give it to teachers, it's done, isn't it? Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we make, is that this is, if we just make this document, then it's done. We can just kind of tick that off the list. And first of all, it's really hard for teachers to implement something when they don't understand the thinking and the rationale behind it. And if you think about what Lawrence Stenhouse says about the fact that teacher development and curriculum development need to go hand in hand, that actually in order for somebody to be able to do something, enact something successfully in their classroom, they need to know why this is in this order, like the reason for it, and how you manage and handle that different knowledge with the students in front of you. So you need to actually have quite a lot of understanding yourself of where the knowledge fits within the bigger picture of the subject, in order to work out what do you prioritize, or what do you speed up, where do you kind of take the time. And I think that's really, really tricky. And it's also the fact that curriculum is dynamic. And so we can't ever say, oh, it's just done, but actually it's something that we need to be thinking about. And it's a process. You don't equally want people rewriting curriculum plans completely from scratch every single year, but you do want the fact that, if we think about Michael Young's idea of the Future 3 curriculum, that it's something that does develop, and those subject associations are working on that, and it's about engaging with that conversation.
Fab. And Michael Young you use a lot in your chapter, and I know Sarah, who we'll talk to later, does as well. I've got experience of leaders looking at the goal of GCSE or A-level results and demanding that the curriculum addresses that all the way through the school. Are there any pitfalls behind such a demand?
Yeah, I mean, it's an understandable one, and obviously results are important, but I think there's just a danger that you then mistake the final performance, for the curriculum. And actually, building up to being able to achieve at GCSE or A level is about actually building a whole load of components of knowledge and skill that allow you to then perform in that final exam. There was a really interesting article in Teaching History this month about world building in history, and talking about how students need to get this idea of an imagined past. And something like that would actually, if we were trying to just teach them by just practicing the exam, they're never going to build up this concept of the past and of what that world looks like. So they're actually not going to be able to achieve. So you actually end up, I think, causing problems, first of all, because they can't actually achieve the thing you're trying to get them to achieve. But secondly, you're narrowing the vision of what actually education should be for. And then actually we should be opening their eyes up to the whole of the subject. So I think, yeah, you fall into those two potential dangers if you kind of think of exams as the end goals of a curriculum.
So we've got a comment. Somebody's asked about that history paper. Do you have a reference for it? Do you remember?
I don't have one right on me, but I can send it through. I'll find it and put a thing in.
Where was it from?
From Teaching History.
From Teaching History. Thank you. Summer, thanks so much. It's such a privilege to talk to you, and your contribution to the book is a real guide to action for curriculum leads and head teachers across schools. So thank you so much. Do we have John? John earlier was on the tube as he was checking in here.
Hello, everybody.
I worked for John Hutchison on the advisory group developing the early career framework. And during that time, I remember John often used to reflections on his own development and how that had been accelerated at his school to unpick what's required by teachers, and particularly those at the start of their careers. Reach Academy Feltham is one of a few schools that has metaphorically torn up the orthodoxy to try and do things better. As assistant head teacher at Reach Academy Feltham and visiting fellow at Ambition Institute, I know that John has plenty to say on school leadership, and his chapter on professional learning has plenty of that. It is ace. So John, you start your chapter talking about the lamentable state of professional development for teachers. Where did it all go wrong?
Well, asking where it all went wrong implies that we had it right at some point. And I'm not sure we ever did. I think that the literature is pretty clear on that point, that professional development within teaching has always been patchy at best, rarely if ever evaluated in terms of student outcomes. And so, to be honest with you, it's difficult to see how we would even know if professional development across school systems was having the sort of effect that we would ostensibly like it to have. Partly that's because if we trace the history of educational research back to the 60s, which is where I sort of start with in a chapter, there was a bit of a project just to prove that schools did make a difference, because that was a genuine sort of point up for debate. After quantitatively demonstrating that there are differential impacts between schools, it was then the project to sort of demonstrate how. Once we've got the that, we need the how, and the last part of that puzzle really is sort of translating how, once we sort of pick out what makes some schools and especially some teachers better than others, have a bigger impact than others, how do we translate that from one place into another? And that really is what teacher development is all about, and it's something that I think we're still struggling with at the moment, because the easy thing to do, as has been mentioned by yourself and the other speakers, is to focus on those superficial elements. And so that, I think, is the project that we're all grappling with at the moment.
Your chapter talks briefly about what went wrong, but then you go on to talk about where professional development magically goes right, establishing an amazing culture of learning. Can you describe what leaders know well to make that happen where you work?
Yeah, so I think that, that one of the things is drawing on some fields that we perhaps wouldn't traditionally have. So drawing on researchers like Anders Ericsson and his work on expertise, who sadly passed away this year, and also David Berliner focusing more explicitly on teacher expertise, and the Masters in Expert Teaching, which is what I do on the for Ambition Institute, really focuses on that idea of teacher expertise and sort of understanding that as a spectrum that we hope to move people along. And as has already been mentioned, we find that in any field, experts rely on lots of well-organized, domain-specific and actionable knowledge. It's organized in different ways to novices, and we need to build those mental models, and that's a slow process, which is why it can often be shirked by schools. Building that expertise requires a lot of experience, but experience isn't enough. And so we really want to help teachers to sort of expedite them along that path of expertise, both building mental models and crucially having the difference in the classroom. And we rely on instructional coaching to do that. That's not the only thing that we do. It's something that I mentioned in the chapter quite heavily because we think it's a really good bet. So Dr. Sam Sims and Stephen Farndon at Ambition again have spoken about how instructional coaching in the literature on teacher development is probably the sort of the best bet in terms of being an empirically validated teacher development model. So what that means is leaders identifying a small tweak in practice that will help teachers to secure great pupil outcomes, and understanding that rests on large amounts of formal knowledge. So that might be understanding something like cognitive load theory and how pupils learn, but also tacit and informal knowledge. That might be knowing the pupils really well, for example, which is a crucial component of great school leadership and great teaching. And some people in the chat have been mentioning, this is a dynamic, context-specific situation, and they're absolutely right that it is. And so developing those elements of knowledge is just as important as developing the formal knowledge as well.
So I've heard over a very long period of time, actually, that coaching is like our best bet for developing teachers. But I've seen so many examples of it implemented really badly, usually because somebody has a very clear idea, but nobody else does. So how, I'm convinced that a few of you at Reach Academy Feltham know a lot about professional development and instructional coaching. How do you make sure that everyone has a strong understanding and that you've got alignment around that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think you're absolutely right. And coaching is something, instructional coaching, getting it done really well is really hard. It requires a lot of investment. It requires a lot of commitment from all parties. It's hard emotionally, I think, because it can be tough to sort of always be on that path to expertise means that you're always working on something. And so I receive an action step every week. Somebody comes into my year 5 classroom and tells me that my explanations are terrible, and that's not what they say. That's true, but they say it in a kind of way. And so we're really clear what coaching is. So we use examples, but we're also really clear what it isn't, because coaching is a really slippery word, and it's used for all sorts of different things. So we're clear that we're talking about instructional coaching. We base a lot of that understanding on the work of Matthew Kraft, Brown University, who has 5 sort of criteria that I go through in the chapter. That instructional coaching is individualized, it's intensive, it's sustained, it's context specific, and it's focused. We've distilled that into a really short sort of model, leaning on others like Paul Bambrick-Santoyo, the ARC Multi-Academy Trust, Doug Lemov, about how we want teachers to see it, name it, and do it, because we want to really cut out all of the chaff and just get to the wheat. And we actually recruit our teachers on this basis. So if teachers want a job at Reach, they will teach one lesson for 20 minutes, and then we'll give them a coaching session, an instructional coaching session halfway through. And we'll say, we thought that was great. We thought that the way that you set up this task was fantastic. We think that it would be even better if before you moved on to the feedback section of the lesson, you collected in some whole class responses. And so we'd like to see that in the next lesson. And that, if teachers love that, then Reach is the right place for them to come and work. If it's not for them, then they know really clearly that this sort of model doesn't work for me, and it's not for everybody. I argue in the chapter that maybe it should be.
So you and I, when we were on the ECF group and in other circumstances, have had the argument over kind of subject specificity and phase specificity, and we've argued, very fraternally about this. but broadly, we think the subject is really important. Is that important in this? So at Reach, does the teacher development differ depending on the subject? Do maths and RE teachers have to be specialists, or does it matter by phase? As in, do they have to be coached by specialists? Is that desirable, and why or why not?
So this, I think, is a really knotty question, and it's where we need to drill down into the context. And this is where it can be a bit annoying and frustrating, because it would be nice if we could just have a nice laminated sheet that says, with a little flow chart. In truth, we think that there are elements that are phase agnostic and subject agnostic of really great instruction. Some of those, so informed by cognitive load theory, and the SESI guide gives some clear strategies. For example, using worked examples. We think that whether you're a reception teacher or whether you're an A-level PE teacher, some form of worked examples is likely to be a really effective way of helping pupils move from novice towards expert. Of course, the way that happens, that's really where the devil is in the detail. We also think that there are subject-specific elements of development that are crucial, and so instructional coaching is a large part of what we do. It's not all of what we do. We will have specific subject-specific development meetings, subject knowledge development meetings. We think that the relationship between the coach and the teacher is also really crucial. That needs to be a really trusting relationship for us to get that desired outcome. So if it's not too much of a cop-out, it's complicated. We think that there are elements that are really, where it's really desirable to have a coach, especially we found where teachers are more sort of proficient and experienced. Having a coach that's really experienced in that subject can be tremendously helpful. But there are also lots of elements of teacher development where we don't think it's as necessary.
Fab. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. Is a really, and I know we'll continue to argue about that significantly. John, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing so generously the approach at Reach Academy Feltham in the book. Much appreciated. From John, we're going to move over to Sarah Barker. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
It was really important for us to capture what's commonly referred to as middle leadership in the book. I know some people hate the term middle leadership, but whatever. If you try to capture, but if you try to capture all subjects, roles and phases, that's about 7 books. So there's a hint there at John Catt about what they might want to commission. But trying to capture them all to exemplify the challenges of one example of middle leadership, I asked Sarah Barker to discuss being ahead of English. Her chapter is enlightening for all middle leaders, particularly building on what Summer has said on curriculum, but also for senior leaders and head teachers on how to let middle leaders lead and what we need to know to get the most out of middle leaders. Sarah's at Orchard School in Bristol, and as we're about to see, she's very wise. One of the premises we talk about around the book is that we may have overestimated the usefulness of developing generic leadership competences in running schools. In your experience, does this apply to a middle leader, and why or why not?
I think it absolutely applies to middle leadership, Stuart. I think we often see outstanding middle leaders in schools displaying incredible traits, like you mentioned them in the opening to the launch tonight, resilience, tenacity, strength of character, empathy. And I think a mistake that's often made is that we see these things somehow as developed through leadership training or leadership as a generic skill. And you also said something that really struck a chord with me, which was that it's often leadership can be like a post hoc label. I can't remember the exact phrasing you used, but it's applied after the event. So we see things that work well in a leader and we go, oh, that was good leadership, without actually identifying exactly what those qualities are. And really the qualities of a good middle leader, I think, is complex and layered and a very rich tapestry of many other skills, knowledge, experience and expertise.
So specifically, you write about leading English because we didn't want to make it generic. Can you give us one key takeaway from your chapter?
I think one thing I discuss in the chapter is the necessity of opening up and sustaining, crucially, a dialogue in and between teachers within the English team. And to me, this is because every team member needs rigorous knowledge and understanding of what we're teaching and why. And the why is absolutely imperative. So even within some subject faculties, we sometimes see kind of off-the-shelf curriculum models and subject content without each individual leader, without each individual teacher having a really strong grasp of what we're doing and why. And I think the middle leader is maybe the linchpin in enabling the dialogue to take place and ensuring that the team are pushing forward with the same shared understanding of what's being taught. And the dialogue is vital to keeping faculties alive and up to date with the needs, partly of the school community, and I'll clarify what I mean there. So faculties within schools need to adapt and change, just as maybe other academic faculties do higher up the education system. So as new developments come to light and the focus shifts within the subject community, so school faculties need to be prepared to change, and this is enabled through dialogue within the faculty. And if I have time, I'd like to give an example from the book, which is that if we realise our English students don't have perhaps an understanding or a grasp of, say, the Victorian era when they reach Key Stage 4, then we need to shift our Key Stage 3 curriculum to weave through those threads effectively. Now, I know that sounds obvious, but I'm not convinced it always happens, and it's the middle leader that's crucial in enabling that. Perhaps if our feeder primaries start teaching a novel that was one of our Year 7 novels, then really it's all power to them. They're just doing what many secondary schools are doing and upping the ante, and the onus needs to be on the secondary faculty to shift and change the Key Stage 3 curriculum to reflect those needs, and that's a really exciting opportunity. And I think all members of the faculty need to be empowered and join that discussion to make sure everybody's on board with the subject knowledge and the understanding of what we're doing and why.
I can see Samantha Baxter in the chat is talking about the leadership of Ulster at primary and talking about similar challenges and how they fit together. I hope that after reading your chapter, Sarah, that school leaders will reflect on their leadership and whether they allow subject specialists to do their job. So this is your opportunity to tell senior leaders and head teachers out there what are heads of department, and if you need to, specifically heads of English, need from school leaders.
I think in an ideal world, Stuart, I would possibly want the senior leadership to be subject specialists, but I do understand and know that that's not always possible. I mean, as an assistant head, I line managed sports and health for 2 years, and honestly it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And I've got this thing in my head which I call systems and keys leadership, so I can help them sort out rooming when that goes wrong, or data entry and glitches in Sims and things like that. You know, I knew who was teaching which course, but actually what was a real challenge was understanding the content of the curriculum, the knowledge the children needed, and what were they doing for their progression model, and helping that team to continue in the right vein in terms of, you know, that knowledge. And I know John just mentioned the coaching model, which is something we do at Orchard. We've moved away from the very traditional longer observations. It sounds like our model is quite similar. And coaching out of specialism is really difficult, and it's important, I think, that leaders make an effort to understand that curriculum content. And I don't mean going out to get an English degree, you know, it's going to be impossible, but I think it's very much appreciated by middle leaders when their line managers have a grasp of what children need to know in the subjects. And it's helpful to be able to have an open discussion about areas of the curriculum without blank stares. And I'd like line managers to understand very specific things in the subject. You know, I'd like my line manager as a head of English to understand what's meant by the concept of the author, or perhaps critical lenses, and be willing to learn with the team. And something I discuss in the chapter is about, well, I've mentioned already, the discussion and opening up that CPD and making sure that the curriculum is evolving and changing. And I think that it's appreciated if the line manager for that subject can come along and learn with the team, to avoid those kind of jaw-dropping misconceptions that are often held by leaders.
I think it's really interesting and really insightful to suggest that leaders quite often spend a lot of time on the things they know about. So, for example, you called it systems and keys leadership. You know, if you're opening a new school, it might be talking about the name or whatever it might be. But actually, the effort and the to get to know more about what it is you're leading, despite the fact that that's super challenging. It goes back to what was said earlier on, particularly by Summer, I think is really crucial. Really quickly, because we are running out of time.
Sure.
Have you had any insight about, I mean, your chapter focuses on English because we had to take an example. Like, do you think it's similar in other subjects, and have you any insight to that?
I think it probably not. I mean, I think there are crossovers with some subjects. So I've led drama. I think Summer Turner covers this brilliantly in her chapter. I mean, there's some areas of each subject and approaches to each subject which are so different that leadership of them is going to inevitably be very different. And I think it can be sometimes a mistake to think that anyone can lead any subject, because we end up trying to shoehorn in quite generic approaches to a subject which has its nuances and needs to be treated as a discrete subject.
Thank you so much. I found what you wrote in your chapter really insightful and challenging to me personally in a good way. It was a really super contribution. So thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you to all the contributors this evening. It's been a great discussion. We've heard from 7 people about their chapters in the book. The chapters exemplify an approach to school leadership, one that is domain specific and values much more than I think the literature, training, or even the inspection regime currently does, that leaders know as much as possible about running schools and really unpick what expert leaders do with that knowledge. There are further chapters in the book from Matt Stamford, director of the school's history project, on assessment. I can tell you Matt was the head of history of one of my previous schools and revolutionised our assessment system. He's one of the brightest people that I know. And he talks about what leaders need to know, including about validity, reliability, and what we can really do while not allowing assessment or the assessment system to drive workload. We have a chapter, as we've heard, from the Reading Ape. I don't think there's a more important job for head teachers than to ensure that all of the pupils in your institution can read as well as possible, particularly for primary schools. This means as efficiently as possible. If you've read the Reading Ape's blog, she is just stuffed with references to research, and I don't think you can fail to find something that will tweak, you know, what you do or what we do as school leaders. And this chapter is a phenomenally well-written chapter. One of the best schools I've ever visited is Dixon's Trinity Academy in Bradford. Luke Sparks, Executive Director of Dixon's Academy Trust, and Jenny Thompson, Principal at Dixon's Trinity, have written a chapter detailing their best bets on establishing what I know from seeing it is an unbelievable culture there. It means that my schools have been significantly different from what I've seen. And I know they also have a YouTube channel launching very soon. From the same school, Nicole Dempsey, a force of nature in the SEND world, she's a very high expectations Senko. It is impossible, in my view, not to read her chapter and immediately take several things away about running a better school for all pupils, including those with SEND, and that's very much the spirit with which she writes her chapter. I also think that she'll provoke some discussion. You know, I implicitly criticised the word passionate earlier, but Nicole really is passionate, and it comes through in spades in that chapter. And finally, if we're talking about domain specificity in schools, we have to talk about pupils' learning. This is an area I think school leaders just need to know a lot about. We have the legend that is Dylan William, and will be known to many watching, Emeritus Professor of Educational Assessment at University College London, who over the last 20 years has focused on supporting teachers all over the world to harness the power of assessment to support learning. He's written a chapter about what leaders really need to know and do about learning and memory. I'm so excited about this book because all of the contributors have approached it with some humility. We're pretty sure that despite the extensive references to robust research, that we can get better. So, for example, I know that Tom and Jen are eager to hear feedback on their persistent problems of school leadership and whether they've got them right. I know that all of the contributors have approached their chapters eager for feedback. If you buy the book and read it, please tweet about it, whether you agree with us or not, write about it and discuss it. I'm really grateful actually to those who don't agree with some of the bets we're making, who've already engaged in discussion about the perspective and about leadership. I think will further our collective understanding as a result and make all of our schools better for our pupils. but even those of us that embrace to a greater or lesser extent that leadership of schools is a domain-specific enterprise, we need to challenge and discuss and debate. This book seeks to simultaneously add to, shape and kickstart that discussion and debate, and I'm really hopeful that it goes some way to doing so, ultimately to the benefit of our young people. Thanks so much again to the contributors this evening and the contributors to the book, to Ambition Institute for hosting and organising, and John Catt for publishing and the virtual wine, and researchED for allowing me to take a perspective and collect this group of excellent pieces of writing. I know, Tom, you want to say something at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. So I get the final word, which is really exciting. If anyone's ever met and talked with to Stuart, you'll know how excited I am at getting that final word. Just to say, Stuart, thank you. You've done an incredible job hosting as well this evening. There's been lots of praise on social media for your ability to host. So some more expertise that you've brought to proceedings. I can't wait to get my hands on an actual copy and read the rest of the chapters from some of the people who are not here today. Huge congratulations to Stuart on finally getting the book over the line. For anyone who's ever been involved in editing or bringing a book together, you'll know how hard that is, especially when you're running a group of schools. I'd like to finish with a few very quick plugs for our hosts this evening, researchED, John Catt and Ambition Institute. First of all, the book and John Catt. So you can now order your copy today from Amazon or direct from John Catt's website. We're going to tweet the link out again to make sure you can find it if you haven't got it already. John Catt, of course, now have an ever-growing number of edubooks, and with half-term coming, you can pick up some holiday reading there as well. researchED, of course, are sadly at the moment unable to run events in the normal way that we would be doing, but I thoroughly recommend keeping an eye on the researchED website or the Twitter feed for announcements soon. And in the meantime, there are other books in this series you can read and a wealth of videos on the researchED home website that were put together by lots of colleagues during lockdown. Finally, to Ambition Institute, if you're a senior leader in a school or a trust, there are opportunities for you to keep getting better at Ambition. At the moment, just a few days left to apply for our headship program, which supports senior leaders to prepare for their first headship, and for executive leaders, a program for leaders who are looking to scale up their impact across multiple schools and work across several schools. Applications for this year's cohort close next Tuesday. So get in touch by the website or through the various social media channels if you're interested. So to wrap up, a big thanks again to our partners, researchED and John Catt, all the folks at Ambition who have been working really hard behind the scenes, to Stuart, all the guests tonight, all the contributors who wrote chapters and weren't able to be here. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you who have attended this evening and for contributing to the discussion, both in the chat and on Twitter. As Stuart said, the debate here is really important, and finding a way for us to discuss, debate, agree and disagree, to challenge each other in constructive ways is so important. I look forward to continuing the discussion with as many of you as possible. Thanks all once again. Good night.